I sense that Negro life is a sprawling land of unconscious suffering, and there are but few Negroes who know the meaning of their lives, who can tell their stories.
Born September 8, 1908, on Rutgers Plantation, about 20 miles east of Natchez, Mississippi, Richard Wright is the son of struggling parents. His father, Nathan Wright, is a poor, illiterate sharecropper. Ella Wilson Wright, his mother, is a low-paid teacher at a segregated school, and she helps her husband farm. The Wrights are descendants of the first seized African slaves who landed in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. When slavery ends with the close of the Civil War in 1865, thousands seeking ways to survive turn to sharecropping. The area they live in is one of the poorest in the nation. A system of legal segregation called Jim Crow presses them into the lowest paying jobs.
So it was a system started in the early 1800s, probably 1830, 1840s, when you saw an image of blacks becoming popular in the South. The image, as I said, of blacks being ignorant, of blacks being always smiling, of them being stupid, of them carrying razors, of their eating watermelon and fried chicken. This image became very much part of a national image, that people that had no connection with blacks personally absorbed and accepted this image of all blacks. And what this did was permeate into what was custom in the South became law. And these Jim Crow laws emerged, which totally stripped away black self-identity, black self-esteem, black personhood.
Finally, in 1914, Wright's father gives up sharecropping and moves the family to Memphis. By this time, Wright has a brother, 4-year-old Leon. In Memphis, his parents still can't get decent employment because of Jim Crow, and Wright's father starts to feel hopeless. He starts drinking heavily and womanizing. This same year, he leaves his wife for another woman.
I used to brood upon the unconscious irony of those who feel that Negroes lead so passional an existence. I see that what has been taken for our emotional strength is our negative confusions, our flights, our fears, our frenzy under pressure.
Over the next 2 years, Wright's mother works more low-paying jobs to support her sons. On many days, she doesn't have enough money to buy food, and they go hungry. In 1916, she enrolls Richard in the Howe Institute at the age of 8 to start his formal education. But when his mother gets sick, she must withdraw him because she can't pay the tuition the school has to charge because it receives less money from the state for education than white schools. While she is ill, she places her sons in an orphanage for 6 weeks. When she recovers, she moves with her boys to Elaine, Arkansas to live with her sister, Maggie. But 2 years later, after Maggie's husband is found murdered in his profitable saloon by whites who want his trade, the family moves to Jackson, Mississippi to live with Ella's mother. After a brief stay, they return to West Helena where Wright's mother suffers a stroke. Richard is sent to live with an uncle and Leon to Aunt Maggie, now in Detroit. Ella is sent by train on a stretcher to live with her mother in Jackson. When Richard rejoins her after a few months, she has a second stroke. 3 years pass before Richard, now 13, can get back in school. In 1921, he enters 5th grade at Jim Hill Public School in Jackson and is soon promoted to 6th grade despite having practically no formal education. 2 years later, he enrolls in Smith Robertson Public School in Jackson. Wright is exceptionally bright and gets good grades even though he is bored and daydreams in class. To pass time, he writes short stories and sends them to the newspaper to try to get them published. After the local African-American newspaper prints a story, this encourages him to vow to leave the South one day and be a writer. Wright graduates first in his class in 1925 and in the fall enters 10th grade at Jackson's Lanier High School. The same year it becomes the first high school to open for African Americans. But he quits soon after the first year when he's convinced the educational system hasn't taught him anything he can use for an occupation. Now he believes that African Americans can't get ahead with an education. After many brief menial jobs where he meets racism from threatened whites and usually ends up fired, Wright moves to Memphis by the end of the year. In this city, he faces the same situation as in Jackson. He's stuck in the poorest jobs and is hit hard by harassment from white co-workers who want him fired because he refuses to act inferior. One of them tells Wright, "If I was a nigger, I'd kill myself." But Wright is determined to keep his dignity on these jobs and stand up to the abuse. Then on his way to work one morning, he stops by a newsstand and reads a newspaper article by H.L. Mencken criticizing Southern leadership. Deeply impressed by his courage, Wright wants to know all he can about Mencken. He gets around the library's policy excluding African Americans by forging notes saying he's getting books for a white man. In the library, Wright hungrily reads books by Mencken, Sinclair Lewis, Theodore Dreiser, and many other authors. He discovers that writing can influence social change, and this inspires him even more to use writing as a weapon. Wright strains day and night to grasp these talented writers' style in an effort to develop one of his own. After 2 years, he moves to Chicago when he believes there is better opportunity in the North. While no Jim Crow signs are posted in the North, he soon finds out there are ceilings for African Americans here too. He finally manages to get hired as a letter sorter in the post office. But his pay is so low he can just barely support himself, his mother and brother, now living with him in a cramped apartment in the South Side ghetto. Listening to the cool sounds of jazz in the clubs that line the streets is one way the people loosen up from the grind of working paycheck to paycheck in the profit-driven northern plants. When the Great Depression sweeps across the nation in November 1929 and the nation's economic base collapses, Wright, along with millions of other Americans, is unemployed. To revive the economy and put Americans back to work, President Franklin D. Roosevelt creates the Workers' Progress Administration, a national public jobs program.
The Depression of 1929 hit blacks like a chandelier falling to the floor, breaking into many pieces. The black community was devastated. Writers and other artists were devastated as well. Many of these individuals were thrust into to jobs that street sweeping. The WPA definitely stepped in and made things a whole lot better, but you still saw that artists, and especially Wright in particular, had to take a job as a street sweeper.
Under the WPA, Wright gets hired as a publicist at the Federal Negro Theater. Then in 1931, his short story Superstition is published in Abbott's Monthly magazine, giving him wide exposure to mainstream readers for the first time. The next year, he joins the John Reed Club, a communist organization, and meets other writers who are in the Communist Party. Wright is heavily influenced by the party's platform and becomes a member by the close of the year. Over the next 3 years, he writes poems, short stories, and essays in many leftist publications and builds a large base of readers. By May 1937, Wright, now 29 years old, decides to move to New York with no job and very little money.